This episode is a big milestone for the podcast as it's episode 100. It's a special episode, and so for this one, I thought I'd do something a bit different. I thought you all might find it interesting and helpful to see what a tax career can look like over the first 9 years, and in particular, what mine has looked like. I share stories and experiences from the different stages of my career so far, and an insight into how I got to this point. You're listening to episode 100 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps tax professionals to progress, develop, and improve their careers.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode. Episode 100, who would have thought that we'd get here? It's hard to know what I was thinking back when I started the podcast. I may have hoped of getting this far, but I'm not sure I knew what would come of the podcast. But here we are, episode 100. The most popular episodes have always been ones to help people with passing the ATT and CTA exams, and I think a lot of you found the podcast as a consequence of these episodes. But there's other ones that have been popular too over the years, and just to name a few, we got episode 1, which is about tax research, would you believe, and that has got almost 1,000 downloads. Is it a coincidence that my first masterclass was to help with tax research? Probably not. Episode 49, which is 5 skills to master early in your career, that's close behind episode 1. Episode 76 was pretty popular too, and it was only out about 9 months ago. And it's why and how to take control of your tax career with guest Charlie Friend, and that's already above 900 downloads already. This one is probably my favourite episode to date, actually. The podcast would never have been possible without me working in tax to begin with, and over the years I've interviewed a lot of people who work in it. But one thing I've never really shared, at least in any detail until now, is my own career. And the episode is broken down into 4 distinct areas. The first is my first tax job for a business called Aspire. The second is my second job for Dains, where I stayed for 7 years. The third is the podcast and everything related to this, like the training and the writing that I've done. And the last area is my current role for PK Swift Cooper, which obviously is new, but I've touched upon it briefly too. In each area, my aim has been to give you a bit of an overview and share some information that I think you will find interesting. I suppose really what I've aimed to do is give you a proper insight into my career so far. As always with the podcast, I've aimed to give you some information that can help you with your own career too. It might be a little rambly at times, as quite a lot has happened over 9 years, and I thought as this is a one-off episode, I'd rather give you more than less, so I do hope that you find this one interesting and that it doesn't turn out to be a disastrous 100th episode. Rough timings for each area of the episode can be seen in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP100 or by going to the details section of the episode within your podcast player of choice. In the show notes, there is a link to all the episodes already mentioned, the ones mentioned throughout the episode, and also to the books that I've mentioned in the episode too. Anything else that I think will be useful, I will put a link of that in there too. My main aim for the podcast this year is to increase listenership, and you can help with that by being connected to me on LinkedIn and liking, commenting on, or sharing my posts, as that increases the reach of them, and it gets the podcast in front of more people. So if you can do one thing from this episode, please head on over to my LinkedIn page, a link to which is in the show notes. Go to the activity section of my LinkedIn page and hit like, leave a comment, or share it.
Hi, I'm Maisie from Pro Tax Recruitment, and we are proud to sponsor the Tax Professionals podcast. At Pro Tax, we help tax professionals like you to find new roles that are a great fit to you, to find that perfect candidate to add to your team, and everything else in between. We focus solely on tax recruitment, and this allows us to give you current, informative insights into the tax market, helping you to make well-informed decisions. Head on over to the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/pro-tax to see our latest tax roles and our team, all of whom would be happy to speak to you.
Thanks to ProTax for sponsoring the podcast. Kevin Rager at ProTax actually placed me in my last firm, where I stayed for 7 years, progressing from tax assistant up to senior manager. So, if you do want to get in touch with ProTax, but you're unsure who to contact, I can suggest messaging or calling Kevin. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. I've said this quite a few times now on the podcast, but when I graduated from university, I was actually primarily looking at jobs of being an actuary rather than in tax, but tax was always my close second. But because I didn't want to move to London, there wasn't many actuary jobs in Birmingham, so it was just really difficult to get that job, and I wasn't lucky enough to to get any of those jobs that I applied for as a graduate actuary. So I applied for a few tax jobs as well, and kind of the first one I remember where I got fairly far, but not all the way, was actually for Deloitte on their grad scheme in their GES team, which is where the employment tax team sits in that team. And I had an interview with this guy in one of their offices in Birmingham, in their offices in Birmingham, in Brindley Place, and went in there, and it was probably the best interview that I'd had so far. It was just much more of a conversation. We had a bit of a laugh. I told him about certain things. I remember telling him about the story where I drove all the way from Birmingham to Peterborough, essentially for a game of Monopoly. And we just seemed to have a pretty good chat together. So then when I heard back from the HR team that I wasn't successful in that job, it was quite disappointing. I actually found it really hard to get a job after university. I applied for loads of different things, got let down at numerous stages, whether it was an assessment centre, which happened for a Teach First job I went for, whether it was the situational judgment tests or other psychometric tests that they did. I just got down a lot. And so when I heard I didn't get this one too, it was just a bit of a kick in the teeth, because I really liked the idea and the sound of it. And the feedback I actually got from that interview, would you believe, is that, came across really well and a bunch of other things, but I came across nervous, which fair enough, I was nervous. I was always very nervous in interviews back then. And the fact I was nervous in the interview made this person who interviewed me think I would be nervous in front of clients. And I remember thinking at the time, like, but this is an interview situation, right? Like, of course I'm going to be nervous. Like, it's going to be different in the real world. But actually, for like probably the first 3-4 years, I was actually quite nervous in front of clients, because I suppose didn't want to mess up. I wanted to say the right thing. I wanted to give good advice. And when I was going to like speak up and say something beforehand, I could feel myself get a little bit nervous, but obviously I'm well past that now. And then one day anyway, I was in the hairdressers after being let down for another job, this time for a business called Aspire, which was a small boutique tax firm in Bromsgrove, which is not far from Birmingham. And this call I got from them kind of threw me off guard, because they'd already called me up and let me know that I was basically second to get the job. Someone else had a bit of experience and they were going to offer them the job over me. And in that call, they actually told me that the other person had rejected it and they'd like to offer it to me. And that was like such a happy moment for me. And I suppose in some ways a bit ironic, because the starting salary on that job, I remember it because I remember thinking this is low compared to what I've seen. It was £16,000 a year, but I was actually super chuffed to get that job, because it was my foot in the door, foot in the tax world. And I thought, I can now start working on my career, I suppose. The week they wanted me to start actually clashed with a lad's holiday that had been organised, and it was a difficult decision, I suppose. But I thought, you know what, it's better off not to go to this holiday, and it's better off to just start my job, don't take any holiday early on, and just get stuck into it. That's what I did. I actually started on my 21st birthday. Yeah, that was it. I started on my 21st birthday. That was my first day at work for Aspire. My first 2 weeks, I can't remember exactly when it was, but I pretty much spent an entire week in the filing room, scanning and printing off some correspondence or a bunch of files for a client, because a client that we were dealing with at the time had a HMRC inquiry, and we needed to like find all the different emails and all the different correspondence and documentation that was going to support an argument. And I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I got given these massive files, and I had to go through them and identify different correspondence, different documentation that fell into like different categories. And it was, I suppose, an educated guess at best. And I remember asking my manager at the time, I was like, look, I'll go through and like do these things, but can someone check it to make sure that what I'm doing in terms of which ones I'm tagging in certain categories, making sure that it's actually right. So I did that for me, and it turned out that it was pretty much there, which was good. But then I had to spend loads of time going through these massive lever arch files, taking each document out one at a time, scanning it so that it would be printed, and then putting it into a new folder. And I did that. And I remember us going to the meeting. So I actually went with the partner to this meeting, and he took these massive bundles, gets into the meeting, and at one point he starts flicking through them to try and find some information. But in the short amount of time that he wanted to find it, he couldn't find the information that he wanted. I remember just thinking that task of doing all that scanning, all that printing, all that categorization probably ended up being quite pointless in the end. But it was quite a grounding moment, I suppose, because I come straight from uni. I kind of expected to start at the bottom and have to work way up. So it didn't bother me. I took it in my stride, I suppose. But it taught me a lot because, one, it kind of focused me on, I suppose, making sure that I'm doing a good job, because I really didn't want to just guess and give them something that was guesswork. And two, it really helped me with organisation, I suppose. It taught me early on how important it is to be well organised with your files. I was actually really super keen just to get stuck in and learn about tax, which might sound weird to some people, but actually one of the reasons I suppose thought I would like tax is because I wanted to learn about tax. I thought it'd be interesting to learn about the legal side of it and all those type of things. And I just wanted to do a good job. I thought it would be like a solid foundation for my career. If I can get my tax knowledge like now, then it would just mean that my career would be plain sailing from there. So I was super keen, but there was a problem because I couldn't start my ATT there until I'd passed my probation period, which was 6 months. So I could basically do nothing for the first 6 months, which was a bit gutting, but it was what it was. And I just kind of sucked it up. But then when I started my ATT, I put an awful lot of effort into it, even though it was areas of tax that I wasn't working in at the time. So obviously I did personal tax and business tax, and I ended up doing business compliance as well, which was the most relevant one. But a lot of the information I was learning, a lot of the tax I was learning, actually wasn't relevant to the tax I was working at the time, and which was employment tax, so it's still not particularly relevant now. But I just gave me all to it because I thought if I can learn as much about tax as possible, it'll just give me a really strong foundation for my career. So I put an awful lot of effort into that. And just before I started studying for my ATT, which was, I'm going to say, New Year, Christmas and New Year for 2015, so December 2015-ish, I went out to a nightclub with some friends, and the music was super, super loud, all night. Even when you were shouting, you couldn't hear what other people were saying. I came away that night, and my ears were ringing pretty badly. And it was ringing the next day and the next day and the next day. I started to get worried in that, is this ever going to stop? Because I was used to doing a lot of things in silence. All my studying at university was done in complete silence, not with this ringing sound constantly in my ears. And that was the start of me having tinnitus, which was just before I started studying for ATT. So it was really bad timing, really. So not only was I studying for a professional qualification, I was also having to do it in a situation that I'd never done it in before. I suppose I managed to learn to deal with having tinnitus, which actually nowadays doesn't really affect me that much, just sometimes when I'm sleeping. But at the time, it was not nice when I first started studying because I could no longer study in silence. I either had to hear the tinnitus or I had to try and mask it some way with some white noise or some rain noises or some music, just something, because the sound was just irritating me an awful lot when I first started. One of the things on my first job at Aspire is they gave me, as a standard package, no study leave at all for ATT. So everything was done either on evenings or outside of work. I actually was on webinars initially, which were after work. And the days that I had those, they let me move my hours so that I started a bit earlier and leave a bit earlier. But I actually had no paid for study time until I decided to negotiate it, because I thought I should have some study time. Other people out there offer study time. So I think I ended up getting about 5 days in the end for all of ATT. I think that was what I got negotiated. And obviously I was thinking about CTA as well, because I was on the ATT CTA pathway. I just thought there was no way that I'm going to be able to do this really difficult qualification without any study leave, or it would just make it much more difficult. So again, I tried to negotiate some, and I think I ended up getting about 5 days again. That's what they would let me have across all the exams. I will add, they did let me have the exam off as paid leave, but all the studying beforehand and all the revision had nothing. And I think they actually thought that was normal. I don't think there was any malicious from it. I think they actually just thought that was the norm. I think they probably had some duff advice from someone, but that was the case anyway. And I think actually, because I was so keen to start learning about tax, and I had someone in the office tell me that we should always refer to legislation, but I could see that pretty much everyone wasn't always referring to legislation. And because I quite like learning things that I think are difficult and being able to do things that other people can't, I just started getting a bit of a I suppose, a love for legislation. I started using it an awful lot. I just really wanted to get good at it. So that's what I did, and that's pretty much where I first started getting, I suppose, a little bit obsessed with tax research, which has kind of followed me through my career from that point onwards. So also when I was at Aspire, very early on, they had this Excel sheet, which was where they had all their expenses, employee expenses at the time. It kind of pulled things in a spreadsheet. It had some nice formulas in. It had a macro to do things, but it had broken somehow, and they tasked me with fixing that spreadsheet. But when I came out of uni and started work, like, I literally knew how to do the equals, put a number in, plus number. That was the extent of my Excel knowledge at that time. So I just said to them, like, I can have a look at it, but I think I'm going to need to be put on a course because, like, I just don't have enough information now. So I ended up being enrolled on a online course, which I did some of that at home. I did some of it at work when I had time. And I learned an awful lot from doing that course, whilst, I suppose, thinking about this real problem that I had to solve. And it stood me in good stead for the rest of my career. I suppose always throughout my career, I've always been very keen to learn and get better, particularly in areas where I think it's going to benefit me and make me a better tax professional in some way. That's why I was so keen to get my qualifications done, why I was so keen to learn Excel, because I thought they were going to stand me in good stead, and actually doing both those things really have. Ultimately, though, I did leave Aspire about, I think it was 1 year, 8 months after starting, and I left for a mixture of a few reasons, really. I actually didn't like being an employment tax specialist at that point and only doing that work. In my mind, for working in tax, it was very compliance-based, doing tax returns. That's what I'd read about quite a bit beforehand, and I did absolutely no tax returns there. So I wanted to get some experience of that, would you believe? Looking back, I would advise myself that having no compliance work is completely fine, and it's probably better for me overall. I wanted to work in the city for some reason. Like, I just had that image in my head. That's what work was meant to be like. So I wanted to move have a job in Birmingham City instead. The study situation in terms of the package, etc., just wasn't really going to work for me. So I wanted somewhere that could offer me more study leave, which I ended up getting in my next job. The commute was pretty bad too. It was like an hour and a half each way. So I was spending 3 hours a day driving to and from work. So I was having to get up early, I was getting home late, and I was just shattered all the time. And then adding that to trying to study too for ATT at the time, it was just an awful lot. I will say, I know I started on 16k as a salary there. It went up pretty quickly to 18. I would even say that's before my probation ended. It went up to about 21, I think, then, and I ended up having like a 2k bonus. So again, I don't think they necessarily paid low knowing that they paid low. I think that's what they thought the market was. But it was definitely a low salary, I suppose. Maybe it's because I went in there and tried really hard, learned a lot of things, always put my all into any output, so that, like, the work I did, I always thought was a pretty good standard, and I always had good feedback, and I suppose good comments in my reviews overall. The only negative comment that I can actually remember is it was to do with me leaving the office early or not doing any work over my hours, which really annoyed me at the time because I always prided myself on being efficient back then. So I was making sure that I did all the things that I needed to do in the time that I had. But other than that, I actually can't remember a negative comment, really. So then I moved to Dains then. So I was, as I say, 1 year, 8 months into working in tax at that point, and I made a sideways move, really. My title did start as something like tax assistant, but I got that changed pretty quickly to consulting because I thought it was being unhelpful when I was talking to clients. So they agreed to that fairly quickly, but it was a sideways move, and I actually moved for no salary increase. I moved from 21k, I think it was 21k anyway, to 21k, but I definitely moved for no more money, which surprised me because I wanted to pay an extra 5 or 6k when I started out looking. I wasn't even sure it was going to be the right move, actually, but I just felt like, with all the things I mentioned before, that I needed to make a move. And so I just thought I didn't really have anything to lose. To be honest, looking back, I should have had more pay at the point I moved. I almost had 2 years experience at that point. I was basically ATT qualified. I'd had experience in the recruitment sector already, pretty much all my experience was there. And the clients that I dealt with at Dains were pretty much solely in the recruitment sector too. So realistically, I should have had a higher salary than what I started on. But anyway, it's by the by. When I did move to Dains, my idea at the time was to get experience in more taxes than just employment taxes, because I didn't like the employment tax specialism at that moment in time. It wasn't that I didn't like employment taxes, I just didn't want to be specialised so soon. I suppose maybe I wasn't sure about employment taxes because whenever I looked at tax jobs, like in Taxation magazine or elsewhere, like there was very few in employment taxes. And the ones that seemed to be out there the most were like VAT, corporate tax, personal tax, and they just seemed to be paid more as well, at least from the information that I had available to me. In terms of wanting to get experience in the teams, that was part of like the agreement or promise, I suppose, up front before I joined Dains. And the reality was it didn't really happen. Like I had maybe 1 or 2 days where I was helping out in private clients doing some personal tax returns. I might have even had like a day of doing like VAT returns or something too, but that was pretty much the extent of it. And those things, I felt like they only really happened because I really pushed them myself. Like I'd have been really naggy back then for something like that. I mean, I'm still naggy today, but in different areas, but I would have been naggy then. Probably wasn't until, I can't put my finger on exactly when it would have been, but it's probably somewhere between being manager and being senior manager where I became at peace, I suppose, with the employment tax specialism. I look back now, I think I do understand why I felt like I did at the time. But again, if I could go back and give myself advice now, my advice would be don't worry about it, because if you're going to be a good tax advisor, the area that you work in doesn't really matter that much. And actually, because there are less employment tax people out there, I think it's easier to stand out as being potentially a good one. When I was at Dains, that's when I became CTA qualified. So I had a decent study package there. I think I basically got all the classroom study and revision courses. That was paid study leave, which was great. I had the day after the exams, great. So it wasn't the best study package out there, because I've heard of things like at some of the big four, particularly where you might have like weeks off at a time to go study. So it wasn't to that extent, but I was pretty happy with it at the time, and it was fine for me to work with. Like it was good enough, basically. And I never really complained about it. Like I thought it was fair overall, I think is the right way to put it. I did have a 6-month break, actually. It was between finishing ATT and starting CTA. That's when I moved and bought my first house with my now wife. And I just thought moving while studying for a CTA exam is not going to be a good idea. So I didn't. So I took a 6-month break and came back to it straight in the next sitting. So I only missed one sitting overall. But then actually my first CTA exam, so we booked a holiday to Centre Parks, and then when they released the dates for the CTA exams, it clashed. Like it was right in the middle of that holiday that had already been booked. And it wasn't just me and my other half, Amy, going either. It was like me and it was either my family or her family. I think it was probably her family. And so what I had to do is I usually sat all the exams in Birmingham. I had to book the exam in a completely different place, somewhere that I'd never been before. I had to book it there, and then I had to leave Centre Parks mid-holiday to go take this exam and then come back. That was Owner Managed Business Advanced Technical. That's what I was sitting. And so I did that mid-holiday, which was not ideal, but again, I suppose made it work. So I ended up passing that one. And I think I'm right in saying that was actually my highest marked CTA paper. I think it's because the other two I sat, so 2 human capital exams, I sat in one go. And actually, the human capital exams are notorious for being really difficult and having low pass rates. And I actually could have failed that exam. I didn't feel completely confident when I came out of it, even though I put in an awful lot of effort. But fortunately, I did end up passing all CTA exams first time. Throughout CTA, actually, I completely sacrificed my biggest hobby since I was about 12, I'm going to say, which is gaming. So I used to game pretty much like when I first started work, like pretty much every night still, pretty much every day on the weekend, at least for a bit of time. I didn't necessarily spend all day every day doing it, although I did spend a lot of time gaming back then. I just had to sacrifice that hobby entirely. I just thought I do not have time to study for these exams and play, at the time, Xbox, Call of Duty, FIFA. I just didn't have the time anymore. So I basically didn't play Call of Duty for like almost 2 years, which that was just completely out of character for me. I'd played every single Call of Duty since I was about 14, and I'd played all of them an awful lot. So that was definitely different, but I felt like I needed to sacrifice it to make sure that I passed these exams. I did play a little bit of FIFA when FIFA was released each year, but it was honestly minimal. for sure. So it wasn't until after CTA that I kind of got back into the gaming hobby. Straight after being CTA qualified, though, I went through a stage of feeling a bit like lost. Like I had the moment first where I was super happy for passing, which I'm pretty sure everyone feels at the point they become CTA qualified. But I also felt a little bit lost because I was like, I've gone through all these things now. I've had structure. Like I've gone through A levels, which is obvious what you do. You do the exam, you do this exam. You know, there are certain times you have the classes set out for you and everything. Same for university, although a bit more. You have to take your initiative a bit more, and you get your own time to study, etc. Then on to ATT and CTA, which is all very structured still. But then in terms of learning and progressing and stuff, like the structure just seemed to drop at that point. So I did go through this phase of thinking like, what's next? Like, what do I do now? Feeling a little bit lost. And fortunately, my boss at the time, Sam, she thought it'd be a good idea to get me like a career coach, which was actually fantastic. I had like 4, maybe 5 sessions with this person, only like an hour at a time, but it was nothing to do with tax, the coaching. It was all to do with like business and coaching and just being a better professional, I suppose. But those sessions, I learned like an awful lot about me, how to address the problems that I had at the time. One of them of which was people not having credibility with people because of my age and being young, even though I knew what I was talking about. It helps an awful lot with that. She set me like exercises that I did, which helped. One of them was to do with like writing. Sounds a bit cringy. My wife used to say it's counselling rather than coaching, but it was something like write like in a few sentences, like if you were talking to someone, you wanted to explain to them why you know what you're talking about and why you should have credibility. Like, what would you say? And so I did that exercise, which I thought, went pretty well. And she also recommended to me that I read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And so that book, again, I thought was really good. I brought the book and I brought the workbook with it, and I went through both of them from front to back entirely. And that's what got me kind of started on reading business books. I'm not even sure you class it as a business book, but any book that was going to help me with my career in some way from a professional standpoint. And I've read loads of books since. So what I think I'm going to do is I'll put a link to some of the best books in there. But ones that come to mind, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, very good book, worth reading. I don't agree with absolutely everything that's in there, but I do agree with an awful lot of it, and a lot of it has helped me a lot. A book called The One Thing, again, that book has helped me an awful lot, particularly I suppose in having direction and then making sure that you spend time to start moving in the direction that you want to be in. Really good for that. Atomic Habits, really good book. There's so many really good ones that I've read, to be fair, that have all made a pretty big difference to my working life, and I think have contributed a lot for me progressing, I suppose, to the role that I have in the time frame that I've progressed to it in. From reading those books, particularly 7 Habits and One Thing, it stopped me getting caught up in like putting out fires and reacting. So, a lot of people, if you get a call from a client or you get a message from a colleague or you get an email, whatever it is, like you'll potentially just pick it up straight away, action it, and then move back on to something else you're doing. But from reading these books, what I'd realised was like it's very easy to spend time doing like urgent things that are important, but not spending time on things that are not urgent but important, even though we all talk about it. It might be like, we need to create this new process, or we might need to spend doing time X or Y because it's going to really help a lot. But then most people don't end up spending time doing those things. They end up getting caught up in the busyness. And reading those 2 books and kind of putting some of the things I learned into practice, I was making sure that I was spending time every single week on things that were important but weren't urgent. So, just some examples of some things I ended up doing, more recently because I remember them better. But I was tracking time that I spent training staff. So I'd be like, I want to make sure I spend X amount of time each week working on helping people in my team progress and develop and get better. And I was tracking myself to make sure that I was spending that amount of time doing them. It wasn't huge. It was something like 15 minutes a day on average or something like that. But I kept myself accountable to that for an awful long time, which meant that I suppose I could delegate more work and pass more work over, help people get better, hopefully encourage them to stay because they feel like they're progressing and learning a lot. So I did that for a long time. And I did block out time in my calendar each week to spend time on these things. I didn't always adhere to it. I adhered to it quite a lot. So that was one thing I did. in terms of important knowledge at things again, one thing I created when I was at Dains was what I called the work scheduler, which was basically all the work that we had as a team. I would schedule it into like certain weeks or months so that in any given week or month, we could see whether people had capacity, whether people were working over capacity, or whether people were working at capacity. And a big reason I did that is I've had a view for a long time that people shouldn't have to work longer than the core hours unless they choose to. So I didn't want anyone in the team to ever feel like they needed to work longer hours. As opposed to, didn't want to overpromise clients work. So I had no data before that really in terms of like how soon I could complete a piece of work for a client if they wanted us to do it. So that helped with that. And 3, it meant that I was never really doing an excessive amount of chargeable hours. I was always doing on or around like my target for chargeable hours. But that meant I could then spend time in these important non-urgent areas, whether it was business development, whether it was training staff, whether it was hiring people, whatever it is. I never wanted to be too busy on chargeable work because I knew that if all I did was chargeable work, then the team wasn't going to get better and ultimately I wouldn't progress. I started doing that, I'm probably going to say around assistant manager level, maybe even manager level. But once I started doing those things, it made a big difference for sure. Like for me, my kind of ultimate goal always was to progress and to be promoted. But that doesn't have to be your overall goal. It could be that you want to enjoy work more. It could be that you want to get more advisory work. Whatever it is, like if you've got a goal or something that you want, you need to put time aside to help you get there, to help you move towards that each week. And those things have definitely taught me an awful lot. So when I started Dains, I was actually potentially arrogant or overly confident, say, but I was pretty strong technically when I started Dains, even though I was only ATT qualified. Well, not quite ATT qualified, almost ATT qualified. And I always had really good feedback from day one of being at Dains around like my technical ability in terms of research, applying it to different scenarios, and just knowing the answer to the scenarios, the tax answer to the scenarios that we were dealing with. This one day actually, because I knew that that's where I was strong technically, I remember sitting down with the partner of my team in a meeting room, and she got a piece of paper out, and she drew 3 boxes. Pretty sure I've told this story in the podcast multiple times now, but I'm going to tell it again because I do think it was a pretty big moment for me. She sat down, she drew 3 boxes, and she wrote, in the first box, she wrote technical. In the second box, she wrote advisory. And in the third box, she wrote sales. And she says like something along the lines of, these 3 things are like the core to you doing like really well in your tax career. Like she says, technically, you're great, like you're there. Advisory and sales is where you need to do work. Like if you want to be a good advisor, you need to be able to be good in the advisory box. If you want to become a partner potentially one day, you also need to be good or good enough anyway at sales. So technical, I didn't really need to work on. I'd already worked on that. I'd really focused on that early on in my career because I really did believe that it's got to be the foundation to my career. And I probably naively also thought actually that if I was good technically, then that was all I was going to need, which is obviously not true. I know that now. But I kind of then worked on each box one at a time. I prioritized being a good advisor next. And so it's probably in manager grade where I became a good level. I became pretty good at advising and writing good advice and giving it verbally and that. And I'd say it's probably senior manager where I became really good at it. Still always conscious of being better there, making sure I'm more commercial, more practical, more helpful to clients. But how did I kind of get better at advice? It was mainly through practicing, I suppose, in that whenever I was working on it, I was always thinking about the feedback I've been given previously to try and make this piece of advice better than the last one did. So I was always making sure that I was getting better each time, or at least trying to get better each time. And whenever anyone made any changes to my work, I would literally look at every single change that was made and look to understand why, sometimes asking questions for those people. Or always, I suppose, whenever I was doing advisory work, I was always just trying to get better every single time. And that did mean I probably spent longer on some things than I should have done. But my goal was always to get better and improve. Pretty much always had an obsession, I suppose, with work, with wanting to get better at certain things. And actually, it's not just work either where I've got that obsession. So, initially when I started at Aspire, I wanted to get really good technically in using legislation. So I was pretty obsessed with that. Had a lot of time on it. Continued to have that obsession somewhat when I started at Dains and still now. I then became obsessed with just trying to be good at giving advice. And I suppose as senior manager, I became more obsessed with being better at sales, winning work, and doing all that type of thing. And then last box sales, I became, I would say, pretty good at certain elements of BD around senior manager level. I mean, I was winning decent amounts of work actually at manager level, but it really did ramp up when I became senior manager. And the BD activity really that I became good at was whenever I had a current client or a prospect in front of me. So if somehow I'd already got those people there, then I was pretty good at thinking of ways that we could further help them and then letting them know about it and spotting opportunities with them when we were talking. And that's pretty much where all of the work I won at Dains came from. There's a few other little campaigns I did here and there that could have been more successful if I dedicated more time to them. But my main source of winning work was by utilising current relationships, taking advantage of new ones that have been put in front of me and just taking it from there. So really that was just all about like speaking to people, making sure that my pieces of work were really good with them to build good relationships and get them to trust me, being helpful, I suppose, being memorable in some way. All those things helped me with that. Really, I suppose most of my BD stuff I learned from the partner of the team at Dains. So my philosophy around winning work is overall similar. We have got differences, that's for sure. And I do think some views that they had around like marketing, for example, isn't necessarily right. I just think they never kind of cracked the code around marketing, for example. But sales, tech, advisory sales, 3 core areas that I think if anyone works on those, they'll do good. And it was Dains really at Dains when I really focus on getting good in all those 3 areas.
To see our latest tax roles at ProTax, along with our friendly team who's more than happy to speak to you, head on over to the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/pro-tax.
When I was at Dains as well, so that was when I first started hiring people and managing people. So time at Dains, I think I hired 4 people overall. The first one I hired left after about 2 months, which could have partly been my fault. I'm not saying it wasn't mine at all, but I also think it wasn't the right fit for the person at the time. But I hired 4 people in total. And from the second I hired someone, I did actually just want to be a really good manager. And my ethos originally, which has changed somewhat over time, was I just wanted to be like their friend, basically. I wanted them to trust me. I wanted them to enjoy working with me. I just thought if I could be their friend, then that was going to be a really good starting point. I had some experiences where it made me think like they're taking advantage a bit here because they see me as their friend. And, don't get me wrong, I was friends with, I would say, all the people apart from one that I managed, but I think they started taking advantage of that, or some of them started taking advantage of that in some cases. And so that made me realize that, the friend side of things is good, but I need to know when to put my foot down and when to say something and when to put a stop to something, which is what I do now. Friend is still there as a big thing, but ultimately, I don't want people taking advantage of me, I suppose, and it's not good for their own career either when they do that. I've always had high expectations though, and that's probably been my biggest downfall as a manager. So I have high expectations for myself. I've had a tendency anyway to impose those onto other people in a way sometimes that was unrealistic and probably unfair, just because it would be unrealistic for me to expect certain things from trainees and graduates, which I did at some point expect they'd be able to do. And I've obviously learned from that now. And I know that I need to bear that in mind whenever I'm delegating and working with people. I've been too harsh with feedback sometimes too, and it's been demotivating rather than motivating. So that's something that I hadn't done particularly well too. But the thing is, whilst I've had these like blips, if you want to call it that, or bad experiences, I have actually always had people who I've managed, I've always had their best interests at heart, and I've always tried to help them get better. I suppose my issue was, looking back, is that I thought that everyone wanted the same thing as me when it came to work, which was to continually get better and progress, and they don't. And so now I do always make an effort to make sure that anything I'm helping them with is helping them with something that they actually want, and I'm not helping them with something that I think they want help with because that's what I want. From the second I suppose became a people manager, I started working on delegation. I think it's because everyone had always said like how important delegation is. Like, it's kind of known to be a good thing, and if you can master it and if you can be good at it, then it's going to be a really good skill to know. So that's actually one reason why I worked on delegation a lot. I didn't want to work long hours myself. I didn't want to be the person that everything got stuck with because I kept everything. I wanted to spread the workload, and I wanted to give people in the team the opportunity to get better at certain things and get involved in certain things. So I worked on delegation pretty much from day one. My delegation stuff, I suppose I just trialled and errored initially. I had a delegation expert, or someone that was very good at delegation anyway, on the podcast very early on, and I got some tips and advice from that, which I used and applied. I got a book around managing, being a manager, and delegation was a part of that, so I got information on how to delegate well from that. YouTube videos, speaking to people, got some training videos at Dains in the end. So all these things I did use, and then I always, I suppose, put into practice what I'd learned, at least some of what I'd learned, to continue to get better. And that's very much how I got better at delegation. And every time it went badly, I always thought, like, well, why has this gone badly? Is there anything I could have done differently, etc. So just on the kind of obsessions, during my time at Dains, actually, I had like chats with a lot of employers, recruiters, potential employers. I chatted with quite a few different people, and I took one all the way to the end, in that I went through the full interview process and got a job offer. That was actually with Mazars at assistant manager level, and they offered me a flipping good salary actually at the time for compared to what I was on at Dains anyway. So I think I was on a 37 at the time as an assistant manager, and Mazars offered me 45, I think it would have been back then. So it was like an 8k increase, and the expectation on me in terms of BD and everything was much less. So I was actually a little bit tempted. I didn't like the look of the office at the time, and the person that was going to be my manager at Mazars, I didn't rate, so I didn't take it. And I was fine at Dains then. I was enjoying my time at Dains. Had no reason to move really. The money was quite tempted though, can't deny that. I went all the way to the end of a interview process with a business called Veolia, a waste management company, to be in their in-house tax team. I think their salary was 45k as well for that one, and I got to the final two and didn't get offered that one, unfortunately. The feedback was actually something like they thought that I didn't really want the job, which was obviously a bit weird because I'd prepared loads for those interviews, and I'd put myself, I suppose, I tried to paint myself in a good light anyway, and all the feedback I got from everyone as part of it was good. Like none of it was negative. And to be honest, they were probably right. Like, I think I was trying to kid myself that I would like an in-house role at that point in time, and I didn't really that much. It was a really long drive as well to get there, and I'd already had that before when I was at Aspire, that 3-hour commute every day, and I didn't want to go back to a 3-hour commute really. So it was probably good that I didn't get offered that job. I probably would have rejected it anyway, again, even though it was more salary than what I was on at the time. I was just very content at Dains for a long time. I was getting what I needed, which was progression, and I was learning a lot. And whilst that was still happening, I really had no reason to leave really. Yes, pay, I always felt like I was slightly underpaid at every single grade, but there were so many other great things about Dains that didn't bother me that much. Maybe that was naive at me at the time, but I never felt like I needed to move. So my progression timeline at Dains looked something like this. So I started there as an assistant/consultant. That was 2 years. So then it would have been 3 years, 8 months when I became AM, assistant manager, and I was assistant manager for 1 year, 6 months. I then became manager. I think that was during COVID, and I became a manager, which I was a manager for 1 year, 3 months. Then I became senior manager, and I was a senior manager for 2 years, 4 months, which took me up to the point that I left and joined Smith Cooper. And if you're interested to know why I decided to leave in the end and how I left and went through the process and everything of finding a new role, go back and listen to episode 98, because that's a whole episode in its own right. And there's no point me repeating that here because it's a very, very recent episode too. I can't really talk about my tax career without at least talking about the podcast a little bit. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that now. So the podcast, I started that in about May 2020, which was, at that time I was assistant manager. I think it was about 6 months before I became manager. But, why did I start the podcast? I don't think I've ever really told this story on the podcast before, but here it is, and it's not as juicy or as interesting as you're probably hoping it all will be, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So I went through a stage of, me and my other half, for one, are big savers. Like, we're not big spenders, and we were just saving money. And the first thing I was thinking was, we got all this money sitting in the bank, like, let's have a look at investing. Is that not a smart thing to do? So I actually remember I went to Birmingham Library, and I picked out a few investment books, and when we went on a holiday somewhere, I can't remember exactly what it was, but we went on a holiday somewhere, and I took one of these books with me, and I read it from start to finish, and it was a book to do with like different potentially different things to invest in. I had no idea really at the time. I thought about stocks and stuff, but that book was quite eye-opening, so I read that, and I ended up reading a few things about investing, looking into it a lot. I came across a financial, like a podcast that covered your personal finances and investing and things like that, and I listened to a lot of episodes there, and I really did get our finances into like good order, but I was still interested in the investment side of things. So I ended up getting to a point where it was so complicated, and I thought, without doing this as like a day job, like what do I do to just make this simple? And I came across this book that just basically, long story short, said invest in something called index funds. So I ended up investing in index funds, and that kind of stopped my obsession with investing, and that's just something I put money in every month for like the past 4 years, and sometimes put lump sums in. But then it got me on to the next thing, because as I was doing research around investing and as I was learning more and more about that, I came across the concept of side hustles. And before that, I'd never come across it before. And I kind of got the bug in a way. Like there was this blog I read called The Humble Penny, which it's very good, to be fair. I don't look at it anymore because I've kind of moved on. But I came across The Humble Penny, and they were really big about like side hustles to get a bit of extra income on the side. So I got hooked anyway. And the first thing I tried actually as a side hustle was YouTube videos. And it was going to be YouTube videos around tax rules, trying to explain them in a simple and easy way so that people can know what they're on about. And the idea would have been that I would have become a YouTube partner, I think that's the right word for it, and I would get income for the advertisements that go on my videos. And I did, I think, 2 videos. It was both to do with off-payroll working rules in the public sector, I believe, when that came into play. It might have even been private sector, but it was definitely to do with the off-payroll working rules. I did 2 videos, and I kid you not, they probably took me like 12 hours each. They're still available, actually, on YouTube if you did fancy a look at my first attempt, and I was quite happy with them. The audio was a bit bad, and the animations weren't great, but I gave it a go, and I quickly realised that it's just going to take way too long for me to get enough subscribers, enough viewers to make any money from this at all, and it was honestly exhausting. It took so much time, and so I had to go back to the drawing board. COVID hit not long after. I can't put my exact finger on the timescales here, but COVID hit. I listened to a podcast quite a lot of the time called the Smart Passive Income podcast, and they had loads of courses available, and one of them was about like starting a business. And during COVID, because the person who ran that podcast was an architect, he lost his job, and then he started down his like entrepreneurial journey, and because of all that happened to him, and because loads of people were losing their jobs in COVID, he gave this course away for free for a certain period of time. And because he was giving it away for free, I thought, why not? Like, let's just do it. It's COVID, like, can't go out really, and it would be something else to do. I thought I could use the time in a good way. So I went through that course in full. And one of the big things that came out of it was like, if you can find something that you enjoy, something that you're good at, and there's a possibility to monetize it, that's what you should go for when starting a business. And so I've always enjoyed helping people in terms of sharing, what I know, trying to help people get better by sharing my knowledge. I thought I was good at working in tax, particularly in certain aspects of working in tax at that point in time. And the advice out there was always like, as long as you're a few steps in front of your audience, then they will see you as an expert. So even though I was only assistant manager at the time, there's people that was 3 years behind me, so they would still find it useful. So I thought tax, working in it, I'm going to keep getting better, and so why not? Like, it's where a lot of my day-to-day time is spent working there. And then monetization, like, I knew podcasts could be monetized. I also did music tech at college, so I already knew how to edit audio. I had a bit of a head start there. So I just thought, I'm going to give it a go, and that's exactly what I did. So, it wasn't purely because I didn't do the podcast purely to only help people. I did do it with a view to monetizing it someday, but because I did enjoy helping people, it was a bit of an outlet, something I thought I was good at, and it had options to monetize at some point in the future. I went ahead and just did it. in August 2022, I think it was, I went down to 4 days a week then. That was kind of the point in time where the podcast was taking up more time. It was at a point where I could get sponsors. It was at a point where I could start creating training courses, which I really wanted to do because I just felt like there was such a lack of resources out there at the time, particularly around like doing tax research and tax advice. And I still think other than my resources there's still a huge lack in terms of what's available publicly. Anyway, so I went down to 4 days in August 2022. And that's when I made the first masterclass, the tax research masterclass. And then probably about 6 months to 9 months afterwards, I created the tax advice masterclass, which I'm super glad that I did because whilst they were really difficult to create and it was hard to make sales, I learned an awful lot there, particularly in terms of like how to design a good course, how to deliver a good course, how to do BD to sell a course, how to, advertise my classes through the podcast, how to advertise it through email marketing, how to advertise it through LinkedIn. I learned an awful lot. And to this day, the one masterclass that had the most people on was actually the tax research masterclass. And I think once time I ran that, there was 28 people on it or something around that number anyway, which I was super chuffed with at the time. I've got a lot of opportunities, I think, from doing the podcast I didn't necessarily expect to get. So I got an opportunity to write for Tolley's Finance Act Handbook 2022. And I wrote about, I think it was some changes to the off-payroll working rules and also the termination payments. And they were like the two biggest bits, or at least two huge bits, in terms of changes from the Finance Act 2022. And they were offering something like £50 to draft commentary around it. And I was thinking, like, it's going to take me hours to like figure out exactly what this ledge means first. Then I've got to think how to articulate it. Then I've got to think how to write it. So I thought both of them would probably take me at least half a day to do. They ended up taking me more than that in reality. But I thought for £100, there is no way I'm spending all that time on it. Like, this is seriously technical information and they're struggling to find writers. So I just, as I said, I'm not doing it for that. They ended up doubling it. So I ended up getting £200 to do that, which wasn't huge still, but it's okay. And I also thought it could be good from a experience standpoint. It would be good to have my name on a publication that's by Tolley's and a bunch of other things. I've got other writing opportunities particularly for this business called Indicator FL Memo, which I did probably 5 articles for at a pretty good rate, something like, I think it was £400 a time. But I'm not a natural writer. I don't particularly enjoy writing. And I didn't think it was particularly scalable. So I ended up stopping writing for them probably about a year and a half ago now. I did some webinars for CPD store, technical webinars. Same for MBL. I did one for MBL. I think I did 1, maybe 2 for CPD store. Rates there are okay, nothing great, but that opportunity came from doing the podcast. Well, I think, particularly, I did 3 CIOT sessions last year on professional schools, which went quite well. That was paid for, and again, I think that opportunity came from doing the podcast. So I think the reason I got the Rising Star Award in 2023, Tolley's Taxation's Rising Star Award, is mainly because of the things I did outside of being a tax advisor for Dains. I think, that bit was good, and I don't know whether I would have got shortlisted with that alone. Maybe I would have done, who knows. But I think definitely what set me apart from the other people there is the fact that I did the podcast, the fact that I'd done all these things. I did writing, I did presenting, I did training, got a podcast, and no one else had it. And I think it just meant I could write a more unique and maybe more interesting application than the other people, because most of the people are not going to be able to talk about those amount of things, I suppose. At that point, the podcast had probably 70 episodes or something like that, about 400 or 450 listeners an episode. So I think that could have been seen as like impressive, I suppose, to the judges at the time. And I actually think, again, those are probably the big reasons why I won. I mean, I did spend an awfully long time on my application because I self-applied. You can do that. I got the idea from someone else who self-applied before and also won. So you can self-apply. I spent probably like 15 hours, maybe even more, on the application. I wrote it in a way that was completely me, and it told a story and was hopefully interesting and not dull and boring, like I expect most applications to be. And so I think those all contributed to me winning that award last year. It has been hard at times, I will add, by the way, to juggle working 4 days a week as an advisor, particularly because I'm I was a senior manager, now a director, and keeping everything running on the podcast. Sometimes the podcast side of things can seem a bit lonely because like it's all down to me there. Any ideas, any driving things forwards, any changes, all those things have to come through me. So it can be difficult at times, but I wouldn't change it. That's for sure. Like it's definitely given me a lot of opportunities in my career that I wouldn't have got before. And I think it's helped get my name out there. It's helped people become aware of me. It's, I suppose, helped me build my own brand. So, there's other things that people can do that are similar to that. I'm sure it's not the norm, that's for sure. But I know this guy that did this thing called Mitch the Taxman at some point, and, something different out there. I think it was blogs at the time, but did something a little bit different, and it really helped his progression too, I'm sure. So this all brings us to where I'm at now then, which is I've not long now started my employment tax director role at PKF Smith Cooper. I'm on my 4th week at the moment, and I've also had a stag do that I attended the weekend just gone to. So I haven't had 3 full weeks. Well, I've had just about 3 full weeks of work in there at the moment. And so is it what I expected? And in some ways, absolutely it is. And in other ways, it's not. So in terms of the match, I suppose, where it is what I expected, like the culture there and the people there are absolutely great. Like one of the big things I liked about Smith Cooper when I was in the interview stage was the fact that they clearly valued people regardless of their age. That clearly stands there. And also they seemed quite a fun and enjoyable organisation to work for. In terms of maybe shared the same humour as me, or at least some people there share the same humour as me, and for a bit of a laugh as well as having doing a good job. So that is exactly what I expected, to be fair, and it is really good. I didn't expect it to be so refreshing in a way and so beneficial, but that certainly is what I expected. Where it's different, I thought I'd be doing a lot more BD initially to start drilling up, to start getting some work streams set up, start winning some work. And I thought I'd be spending an awful lot of time there initially. I have spent some time there because I want to make sure that I don't neglect it entirely, but actually it hasn't been the biggest thing that I've had to do. So the blocker in the team when I joined was at the review stage, because everything was getting stuck with the current director, I suppose, because they were too busy, so they needed more capacity. I've been able to help with that already. So I've spent some time there. Got a lot of work being passed to us by another company in the PKF network. So I've been dealing with that work. So that's been really good. So I'm kind of managing and delivering that work now with support but from people in the team. I have started to get some BD streams set up. So I've got a few kind of live opportunities. And I'm also spending time there ticking things along in the background so that live opportunities will continue to be added to the list. I've attended my first tax leadership meeting, which was a lot of fun, actually. We did get stuff done, but we also had a lot of fun. I got a cake to celebrate the 100th episode of the podcast that was that's coming up. So that's this episode. Went out for lunch there, which was nice. I've gone out for a few lunches, actually. I went out with my team early on, which was nice to get to know them better because they're all based in Derby, actually. I'm the only employment tax person based in Birmingham. I suppose the idea was I was going to come in and be the Birmingham face, the Birmingham face for employment taxes, which, is starting to happen, but we are very much more of one team than this is Derby and this is Birmingham. So I'm sure I'm going to be the main Birmingham face still, but I think the streams of work won't necessarily always come from Birmingham. I spent a lot of time getting to know colleagues, like speaking to them, having chats. Everyone's been really friendly there. So that's pretty much been my first month, and so far so good. I am enjoying it for sure overall. I've done all the typical induction stuff that you would expect, and so now it's just about continuing with that, trying to make an impact, I suppose. I want to help the employment tax team be as effective and as good as possible, and I suppose build and grow it based on the foundation that's already there, which is a really good foundation, to be fair. So Laura, the current director, the one before me, who's still there now, she's done a good job of building that team from scratch, and hopefully now with me there, it can just help supercharge that growth and improvement a bit more, because there's 2 of us now and not just one. Hopefully you did find that one insightful and interesting, but apologies if not. If you didn't, you probably won't have made it this far anyway. Show notes for this episode can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP100. There are links there to all episodes mentioned earlier in the podcast episode and also to the books I mentioned. Also, this is just worth noting as my next masterclass is coming up in May 2024. If you do want to improve your tax research or advisory skills, then you might be interested in my masterclasses in these areas that make doing both of these less difficult and allowing you to enjoy work more and helping you to accelerate your progression. A link to both of these is in the show notes. And the one that's coming up in May 24 is the Tax Research Masterclass. The next Tax Advice Masterclass is in November 24. As you heard in this episode, my main goal for the podcast this year is to increase listenership. By heading on over to my LinkedIn profile, connecting with me if you haven't already, and either liking, commenting on, or sharing my LinkedIn posts, you will help with that. So if I could ask you to do one thing after listening to this episode, it would be to like, comment on, or share the posts and names in this episode. That would be much appreciated. If you liked this episode, you can get notifications of all future episodes of the podcast by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalpodcast.com/subscribe. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you found the episode useful and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.